Hi, I'm Tara Becker-Utess, a new academic consultant at the Ingham ISD. I'll be specializing in 6th through 12th math as well as social studies. What I've noticed in my time at the ISD is that a lot of the work, especially with the Leadership Academy, has focused on John Hattie's work. As a newcomer to the ISD, I found that what I've been reading in Hattie's work and what I've been learning about at the Leadership Academies really related well to one of my passion areas, and that's flipped learning. I flipped my own AP Government class 2 years ago and then assisted our math teachers at Charlotte in flipping their own classrooms. Many people think of the flipped classroom as simply a set of videos or just the Khan Academy approach, but it's really so much more. After this video, if you still have questions, my contact information is listed on this slide. You can contact me by email or by phone. Like I said, a lot of people think of the flipped classroom as just simply watching videos and coming in and doing the homework in class. But notice there's a difference between the flipped classroom and flipped learning. Flipped learning is a lot more than simply having the students watch videos outside of class and doing worksheets within a class. However, to invoke flipped learning, teachers must follow the 4 pillars. Flipped learning is not a methodology, it's a pedagogical strategy where direct instruction moves to individual learning and the group space is transformed into a dynamic, interactive learning environment where the educator guides students. Notice, these 4 do not tell teachers how to teach. They simply give guidelines on how to structure both the homework portion and the in-class portion of the class. For the flexible environment, this could involve 2 different things. It could involve physically rearranging space to accommodate group or individual activities. It could also involve flexibility in expectations of student timeline in when or in how students learn something, or even in how students are assessed. For the learning culture, this is the idea that teachers are shifted from the primary source of information to a learner-centered approach where in-class time is dedicated to exploring topics in greater depth. Students are actively involved in their knowledge construction as they participate in and evaluate their learning with the teacher as their guide. For the intentional content piece, this is really a key component of flipped learning. And this is where teachers have to determine what needs to be taught in class with the teacher present and what material students should explore at home by themselves. So there might be times that a teacher feels that a content expectation is so challenging that they need to do direct instruction on it in the classroom, and that's okay. There are other times that they might find that the direct instruction piece works best at home, and then there are really learner-centered activities that they can work on in class. The professional educator component means that teachers are not just sitting at their desks while kids are working during the class period. Teachers are constantly observing their students, providing them with feedback relevant in that moment, and assessing their work every step of the way. Teachers also connect with each other to improve their own instructional strategies. So what we're going to look at in the following slides is we're going to look at some of John Hattie's effect sizes and see which ones relate to the flipped classroom. We're also then going to take a look at the checklist that he provides in his Visible Learning for Teachers book and which of those apply to the flipped classroom. So let's take a look at this first pillar, the flexible environment. Here are some of John Hattie's influences with the largest effect size. So notice in a flexible environment, students have a lot of time to move ahead if they're feeling that the material is too easy for them. They have time to accelerate, and the teacher has provided those videos so they can move ahead. And with John Hattie's work, acceleration has an effect size of 0.88. So really helping out those kids who would like to move ahead rather than just being bored in the classroom. Formative evaluation happens every day in a flipped classroom, and this is one of the things on John Hattie's list that has the largest effect size. Teachers make decisions for classroom activities based on formative assessments that happen. In my classroom, this happened at the beginning of the block. I talked to every kid about how they understood the video and made decisions on how we should proceed as a class or how small groups should proceed. And based on that initial formative assessment, a class might look very different from block to block depending on how well kids understood that. Finally, classroom behavior has a large effect size according to Hattie. And because kids are given so much flexibility in how and where to learn the material, behavior problems almost disappear. And this can be seen in Clintondale High School, whose discipline referrals dropped massively after they went to the flipped classroom. Kids are actively involved in the instruction, and so they're not bored throughout a lecture, and so they're not causing those disruptions to the classroom. In John Hattie's visible learning checklist, there's a lot that relate to the flipped classroom, and I tried to pick out the ones that were most relevant to each pillar of the flipped classroom. The first, and I think one of the most important of his checklist, is that classrooms are dominated by student questioning more than teacher questioning. My classroom was started by a Q&A session each block, so I could see where kids were. Kids were the ones asking me questions, and that's where I used their questions to guide the rest of the block. The next thing he talks about is teachers being able to teach multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of interacting. So students are able to construct their own knowledge based on the way that works best for them. Teachers might provide different stations throughout the class period that allows different ways of kids to interact and provide multiple ways for kids to practice that. If it's a student who really is struggling with the material, they might need more practice at a lower depth of knowledge as opposed to someone who's really got that lower level down and they're ready for something that is at a higher depth of knowledge. And finally, the assessment piece. Flipped learning also often includes many different assessments. It doesn't just have to be a paper pencil test at the end as a summative assessment. Teachers might allow students to show their learning based on a instructional video, or it might allow them to work in a mastery learning setting where they can redo standards that they did poorly on. Formative assessments happen all the time. I was able to, in my flipped classroom, and I had classes of 30 plus, talk to every kid every day. And here, that was probably one of the best formative assessments. By listening to what the kid knew about the topic, I could tell where they were at in their learning of that material. So let's talk about the learning culture then. Again, the formative evaluation piece you'll notice is in just about every one of these slides because it happens all the time in a flipped learning environment. You don't even have to wait for an exit ticket. In fact, I rarely did exit tickets in my flipped classroom because by the end of the block, based on all of my observations of those students, I knew where kids were at. Students are involved in creating their own knowledge and making decisions for themselves and communicating those decisions to the teacher about where they're at in their learning. Reciprocal teaching refers to, if you're unaware, refers to an instructional activity that takes place in the form of a dialogue between teachers and students regarding segments of a text. The dialogue is structured by the use of 4 strategies: summarizing, question generating, clarifying, and predicting. The teacher and students take turns assuming the role of the teacher in leading this dialogue. Now, obviously this would be a really easy piece to incorporate into a flipped classroom, and it has a really high effect size. And so the idea of reciprocal teaching is allowing the student to verbalize his or her own thinking. And a lot of times things like this would be cut from a traditional classroom because there simply isn't time. But in a flipped classroom, you really have the entire block for activities where students are taking the role in verbalizing their understanding and their knowledge and their questions that they have about the material. I loved that I was able to see that the classroom discussion had such a high effect size. And I think the big piece here is students are verbally talking about the material. And when you talk about something, you're more likely to remember it. So this happens naturally in a flipped classroom, no matter what the subject is. It happened in my AP Gov class. It happened in the math classes. I've seen it in just about every content area that's flipped. So it might be a small group setting. It might be the entire classroom that's engaging in the discussion. In fact, in technology-rich classrooms, this happens in back channels like today's Meet or Twitter, and this gives even quiet or shy kids an opportunity to share their voice in what they're learning. Finally, the self-verbalization, self-questioning strategy, John Hattie gives an effect size of 0.64. And in a flipped classroom, students are engaged in this every day. They are responsible for asking the teacher questions or asking themselves, what didn't I understand in that video? And then sharing that with their group. And they have opportunities to question real life situations and how those relate to the content that they're learning in their videos. They're encouraged to verbalize their learning to other students and to the teacher, which deepens their long-term memory. Within the learning culture that is focused on students, notice this hits a lot of the visible learning checkpoints. These are just the 4 that I think it hits the most. You could probably assume a lot more, but I ran out of room on the slide. Really here what we're looking at is that there is a balance between teachers talking, listening, and doing. And there's a similar balance of students talking, listening, and doing. In a traditional classroom, it's really the teacher talking, students listening. But with flipped learning, students are really doing probably a little more of the talking and the doing, and the teacher's doing more of the listening. And that takes a while for the teacher to plan lessons like that, but when it's done, it's very, very powerful. Students are taught how to conquer a story problem rather than just send them home to do it on their own. Teachers and students are using the power of peers positively, and this goes back to Mazur's peer instruction model, which can be used really easily in the classroom. And it helps kids verbalize their learning to others and note their misconceptions. So an example of a flipped classroom using the power of peers could be one where you're asking students to defend their answers. And if a student has a wrong answer, it's really hard to create a valid argument based on that. And by verbalizing their argument, they can see where they went wrong. Finally, it's really important in a flipped learning environment that teachers scaffold. And that means that they can't just, here's a giant story problem for you to tackle in class because you've watched the video. They really need to give activities that all students can access. And a great example of this in the math classroom is a 3-act problem where students are first asked just to identify what they know or what they need to know. And so really it doesn't require any math knowledge at all, and it invites all students into this learning. So now we'll move on to the intentional content piece. And so direct instruction does not go away in the flipped learning environment. And notice that direct instruction does have a high effect size because kids do need to learn from teachers. Teachers are more of an expert than the students are. So many times in flipped learning environments, this direct instruction is presented in a video, but it doesn't have to be. It could be through a reading of a text or a reading of a primary source, but teachers decide what content is best to be presented in a video. Now, note, this video should be no more than 10 to 13 minutes for high school students and obviously less for students that are younger. And they decide how to present it. In a video, they might present only the basics of a standard and then go into more detailed instruction in the classroom. These videos allow students freedom in how to receive this direct instruction. They can pause it, they can rewind it, they can fast forward if they understand how to do a particular problem. So my guess is when students are able to rewind and rewatch the direct instruction, that effect size would go up even more. Because flipped educators have so much time in class to work with students, they have an opportunity to help them learn how to learn a topic. So when students struggle watching the video, they have the teacher in class that can provide them other ways of learning that particular topic. And this includes how to even watch the video as well. So a lot of flipped educators will allow their students the first video or the first couple videos to watch in class to teach them how to interact with the video. And finally, for the intentional content, we look at Hattie's spaced versus mass practice. If you think of a traditional classroom, kids might be sent home with 30 math problems that they have to do all at once. As opposed to a flipped environment, students are at home and the video usually follows the I do, you do method where the teacher would do a problem and then ask the student to do a problem at home. And then in class, kids are doing more problems the next day that are a little deeper and not simply 40 problems at home all at once without the teacher there. So we look at some of Hattie's visible learning checklists, and again, there's a lot here. So for the intentional content piece, we look at teachers invoking appropriate challenges. So listening to a lecture in class is not challenging for most students. And so that is really why the direct instruction has went home, because what's the appropriate challenge are the greater depth of knowledge problems. And those are really best in the classroom with the teacher present. Secondly, teachers really can choose what methodology is going to be best, and that's the final step in the lesson planning process. So they can decide what's going to be best at home, what's going to be best in classroom based on their professional knowledge. And finally, because the in-class work is not just a lecture, teachers can really differentiate what is given out to different students within that classroom. One lecture is a one-size-fits-all. It cannot be differentiated, but the in-class work in a flipped learning environment can be. So finally, let's take a look at the professional educator piece. And again, I told you this formative evaluation was going to show up again and again. Teachers spend the bulk of their block in a flipped learning environment observing students, catching where students are struggling right away and providing them feedback right there and then. They can talk to every kid every day. If all students in the classroom are struggling, the teacher can change the course of that lesson right there and then, and they don't even have to wait till the next day. Same goes for this feedback piece. It used to be teachers would wait for a student to turn in an assignment or not turn in an assignment and provide feedback at that point. But in the flipped learning environment, they don't even have to wait until exit tickets are turned in. Teachers can talk to every kid every day to see where their students are at and provide them with feedback relevant in that moment and to assessing their work. Finally, and I think this is one of the most powerful pieces of the flipped learning environment, is that teacher-student relationship. Teachers are talking to and working with kids every day, and so relationships are going to be formed. I found that I knew much more about my students personally and academically as a result of the flipped classroom. And because I knew them better and they knew me better, there was a much better atmosphere of trust, and kids were much more willing to really work in my classroom because of that trust. And again, one of the visible learning checklists is this idea of a high level of trust. Teachers are listening to students every day. They're making adjustments in their lesson plan based on student feedback. Students feel like they've been listened to. And a lot of times in the flipped classroom, in a flipped learning environment, it revolves around mastery learning. The flipped teachers really stress to students that it's about learning and not just about getting that grade, and that students are responsible for their own understanding. Teachers are aware of and aim to provide feedback to different parts, and this because teachers are not in the front of the room giving that lesson and just being the sage on the stage, they can provide feedback to kids about not only the task that they're going through, but the process. They can look at how kids are processing along the way and make changes based on that. And they can also look at the self-regulation. Are kids staying on task? Are they, off on a game or on their cell phone? They can help guide them through that process as well. In the flipped classroom, there's so many opportunities for different assessments throughout the day. So a warm-up could be the first assessment to see where kids are at. And then throughout the lesson, teachers can easily see how kids are doing through a thumbs up, thumbs down, or technology-driven responses like today's meet or Socrative or poll everywhere. And based on those throughout the day, teachers can make adjustments to their teaching to ensure all students are learning. And finally, a professional educator sees assessment as feedback about themselves. If students are watching the video and still struggling, there's something going on that needs to be changed. Or if no students are watching the video, teachers need to think about what's included in that video or how long that video is, or what are you doing in class that makes kids feel like they don't need to watch the video. If you're interested in being taken through the flipped learning process and actually designing a flipped learning lesson, if you are a math teacher, I have 2 trainings that will be coming up and they'll be offered twice this year. 6th through 8th grade will be offered October 2nd and November 19th and January 28th and March 25th. And then in between October 2nd and November 19th will be opportunities for instructional coaching within your classroom as you implement the flipped classroom. 9th through 12th, the same thing with the 2 sets of dates, and again, instructional coaching opportunities between those 2. If you have questions, don't hesitate at all to contact me. If you'd like to sign up, you can sign up at inghamISD.org. So here is my contact information, my email, and my phone number. If you are not a math teacher but you're interested in flipped learning, you're welcome to email me. I do hope to get some social studies dates up and running soon with the same structure as the math. So please feel free to contact me if you have any questions.